Sarah's hands wouldn't stop shaking as she stood at the altar. Michael squeezed her fingers gently, mistaking her trembling for normal wedding nerves, completely unaware that in less than 1 minute, a German shepherd would burst through those cathedral doors carrying her 3-day-old son in his mouth. The baby she'd given birth to 72 hours ago, while Michael thought she was at a spa getting pre-wedding treatments. The baby she'd left at County General Hospital with falsified paperwork, planning to deal with it after the honeymoon. The baby whose father wasn't the man holding her hand at the altar, but the ex-husband she'd told Michael didn't exist. Max the police dog didn't know about lies or wedding vows, or carefully constructed new lives built on buried secrets. He just knew that a baby needed its mother, and he'd tracked her scent across Portland to make sure they were reunited. When those oak doors slammed open and 200 guests turned to see what was happening, when Max walked down that aisle with a newborn cradled gently in his jaws and placed the infant at Sarah's feet, every lie she'd told over 3 years would detonate simultaneously. And the truth that came out wouldn't just end a wedding, it would expose an assault, a crime, and a past she'd been running from since the day she arrived in this city. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Think about what had to happen for this moment to exist. A trained police dog off duty, somehow getting hold of a newborn from a hospital maternity ward. Not barking, not aggressive, just walking with purpose through secured doors and city streets with an infant protected in his mouth the way his breed carries wounded soldiers. Why would a dog do that? Why bring the baby to this specific wedding? Dogs don't understand deception or betrayal or the stories we tell to protect ourselves, but they understand scent, they understand connection, and they understand crisis. Max had encountered Sarah's scent 72 hours earlier at that same hospital, and when he found an abandoned newborn, every instinct in his trained body told him exactly where that baby belonged. But how did he know? What had he witnessed that no human had pieced together? And why, when he placed that infant at the bride's feet, did he look at her with such deliberate purpose, like he was delivering evidence rather than just returning a lost child? 3.5 years before that catastrophic wedding day, Sarah Mitchell had stepped off a Greyhound bus in Portland with 2 suitcases and a promise to herself that she'd never look back at Philadelphia. She'd left behind a marriage that had started with romance and ended with her changing her phone number, sleeping with a kitchen knife under her pillow, and jumping at shadows for 6 months straight. Her husband David had been charming at first, the kind of attentive that feels like love until you realize it's actually surveillance. By their 2nd anniversary, she couldn't visit friends without explaining where she was going and when she'd be back. By their 3rd, she was making excuses for bruises and learning to read his moods before he exploded. She'd filed for divorce and run, getting as far from Pennsylvania as her savings would take her, which turned out to be the Pacific Northwest. What she didn't tell anyone in her new life, what she buried under the fresh start and the sunny disposition she wore like armor, was that the divorce never finalized. David had contested it, dragged it through the courts with technicalities, refused to sign the papers even though she was 3,000 miles away. She told herself it was just paperwork, that the marriage was over in every way that mattered, that there was no point complicating her fresh start with legal details about a life she'd escaped. Portland embraced her the way cities embrace people who need saving. She found work as a financial advisor at a downtown firm, the kind of job where trustworthiness matters and people don't ask too many questions about your past if your present looks stable. She was good at the work, meticulous with details, honest about market risks in ways her clients appreciated. She started volunteering at a women's shelter on weekends, helping survivors of domestic violence navigate the financial reality of starting over. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was guiding other women through the process she was still figuring out herself, offering advice about restraining orders and safety planning while her own ex-husband was technically still her legal spouse. But helping others felt like penance, like maybe if she could save enough women from the mistakes she'd made, she could forgive herself for staying as long as she did, for believing David's apologies, for thinking love was supposed to hurt that way. She made friends who knew nothing about her marriage or her flight, or the nightmares that still woke her up some nights. She built a life that looked whole from the outside, even though the foundation was cracked. Michael Chen walked into her office on a Tuesday afternoon, 14 months before the wedding, needing help with his father's estate planning. He taught history at Roosevelt High School, spoke quietly and listened carefully, and made her laugh within 10 minutes of meeting him by describing his complete incompetence with financial documents using a metaphor about the fall of Rome. He asked her to dinner that same week. She almost said no, her instinct still to avoid attachment, to keep people at arm's length where they couldn't ask difficult questions. But there was something steady about Michael, something gentle that didn't feel like weakness, and she was tired of being alone. Their relationship developed slowly, carefully, like he understood without being told that she needed time and space and patience. He never pushed for information about her past, just accepted that she'd come from Philadelphia after a bad relationship and was building something new. He introduced her to his mother after 3 months, a warm woman who hugged Sarah like family immediately and started teaching her to make dumplings in a kitchen that smelled like home. Everything about Michael felt safe, stable, the opposite of the chaos she'd survived with David. 11 months into their relationship, they were hiking in Forest Park when Michael stopped at a viewpoint and asked her a question that made her throat close up. He wasn't proposing yet, he said, but he could see a future with her, marriage and maybe children. And before they went any further, he needed to know if there was anything in her past that might affect their future together. He emphasized that everyone has history, and he wasn't judging, but honesty mattered to him more than anything. And if they were going to build a life together, it had to be built on truth. Sarah looked at him standing there in his hiking boots and worn flannel shirt, this good man offering her everything she'd wanted, and she made a choice that would haunt her. She told him there was nothing, just a bad relationship she'd left behind, nothing that would impact them. She watched him believe her, watched relief cross his face, and she pushed down the voice, screaming that she was making a terrible mistake. 2 months later, when he proposed at the Japanese garden with his grandmother's ring, she said yes and told herself that the divorce would be finalized any day now, that David would eventually sign the papers, that her past could stay buried if she just kept moving forward. She was wrong about all of it. The cathedral Sarah had chosen for the wedding was a 19th century stone building in the Pearl District, all soaring ceilings and stained glass that scattered rainbow light across the pews. Michael's family filled the left side of the church, 3 generations dressed in their formal best, his mother crying happy tears in the front row. Sarah's side was smaller, just the friends she'd made in Portland and some colleagues from work, the absence of family explained away by parents who'd passed and siblings she didn't have. Another layer of lies, small ones that seemed harmless at the time, but added up to a portrait of a person who didn't really exist. The ceremony had been perfect up until the moment it wasn't. The flower girl had been adorable, the music was beautiful, and Sarah had almost convinced herself that she'd gotten away with it, that her secrets would stay buried, that she could actually have this life she'd built on sand. When the oak doors burst open, the sound cut through the organ music like a crack of thunder. Every head turned. Sarah's first thought was that David had found her, that someone from Philadelphia had tracked her down to object dramatically, like in the movies. But it wasn't a person. It was Max, a German shepherd with gray around his muzzle, walking down the center aisle with something wrapped in blue hospital blankets, cradled carefully in his mouth. The gas started immediately, rippling through the crowd like a wave. Someone screamed. Michael's mother stood up, her hand covering her mouth. The pastor stepped back from the altar, his Bible forgotten, and Sarah felt her legs go weak, felt the blood drain from her face, because even before she could see the tiny hand that slipped free from the blankets, even before Max reached the altar steps, she knew exactly what was happening. Max stopped 3 feet from where she stood and lowered his head with extraordinary care, placing the bundle on the carpet. The baby, a newborn who couldn't have been more than a few days old, stirred but didn't cry. Max sat down, his tail still, his brown eyes moving between Sarah and the infant like he was checking to make sure she understood. Michael was saying something, his voice confused and frightened, asking what was happening, why there was a baby, whether someone should call the police. People in the pews were pulling out phones, some calling 911, others just filming because that's what people do when reality becomes unbelievable. But Max didn't move. He'd completed his mission. He'd brought the baby to the person who needed to see it, and that person was the bride. Michael knelt beside the baby, his teacher instincts overriding his shock, his hands hovering uncertainly like he wanted to help but didn't know how. He looked up at Sarah and she saw the exact moment when confusion began shifting towards something darker, something closer to understanding. Why was the dog looking at her? Why had it brought the baby to the bride specifically instead of just leaving it at the entrance or with someone in the crowd? His eyes searched her face, looking for answers, and what he found there made him go very still. Sarah was crying, silent tears streaming down her face, her bouquet of white roses shaking so violently in her grip that petals were falling to the floor. She wanted to speak, wanted to explain, but her voice had disappeared somewhere between terror and shame. And then Max did something that made the entire cathedral fall silent. He stood up, walked to Sarah, and deliberately nudged her leg with his nose. Once, twice, 3 times. Then he looked back at the baby. The gesture was unmistakable. A connection being drawn that everyone could see, but no one wanted to believe. This wasn't a random rescue. This was a delivery. And the recipient was the woman in the white dress who suddenly looked like she might faint. The chaos that erupted after that was immediate and overwhelming. Michael's mother was crying, but not happy tears anymore. Sarah's maid of honor rushed forward to catch her arm as she swayed. The pastor was on his phone, his voice urgent as he called for help, and Michael just knelt there beside the baby, his face cycling through emotions, too fast to name, his mind clearly racing to make sense of what his eyes were showing him. The guests were shouting questions, making accusations, demanding explanations that Sarah couldn't provide because her mouth wouldn't form words. Someone in the back yelled about calling Child Protective Services. Someone else wondered aloud whether this was some kind of prank, a possibility that died as soon as they looked at Sarah's face and saw genuine horror there. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a secret detonating in real time, and everyone in that cathedral was witnessing the explosion. The wedding that should have been the happiest day of Sarah's life had become a crime scene, and she was standing at the center of it in her ivory gown, with evidence literally at her feet, and a dog who wouldn't stop staring at her like he was waiting for her to do the right thing. If this story has your heart racing, comment, "I'm still watching." Let's see who's truly following till the end. The paramedics arrived in 6 minutes, followed by police officers who'd been nearby when the 911 calls started flooding in. Max's handler, a retired cop named Robert Chen, showed up 12 minutes after that, out of breath and apologetic, explaining that his dog had jumped through a window at his house and that he'd been tracking him across the city. He had no idea how Max had gotten hold of a baby, no idea why his normally obedient dog had gone rogue. The hospital staff arrived 20 minutes into the chaos with their own piece of the puzzle. A newborn boy had been taken from County General's maternity ward an hour earlier by a woman in scrubs who'd walked out a side entrance. That woman, Jennifer Martinez, had given birth to a stillborn daughter just 8 hours before and had suffered a psychological break from the grief. She'd taken someone else's baby in a desperate attempt to hold a living child one more time, placed the infant in what she thought was her car, but had actually put him in Robert Chen's vehicle parked nearby. Max had found the baby within minutes, and instead of alerting his owner, he'd done what his training told him to do. He'd protected the vulnerable and started tracking a scent he recognized. Sarah's scent. A scent he'd encountered at the hospital 3 days earlier when she'd been admitted in labor. The truth came out in fragments, pieces that hospital staff confirmed by checking their records. Sarah Mitchell had been admitted to County General 72 hours before her wedding at 2 in the morning, complaining of severe abdominal pain. She'd given birth at 6 a.m. to a healthy baby boy. She'd signed the birth certificate with a false name, claiming she was giving the baby up for adoption, and she'd left the hospital 6 hours later against medical advice. The nurses had documented their concerns about her leaving so soon after delivery, but they couldn't legally hold her if she insisted on going. She'd walked out of that hospital with her body still bleeding and cramping, had gone home to finish last-minute wedding preparations, and had shown up to the rehearsal dinner the next evening, smiling through the pain because admitting what was happening would have destroyed everything. Michael sat in the hospital waiting room while investigators pieced this together. still in his wedding suit except for a small blood stain on his knee from kneeling beside the baby. His groomsmen had taken the wedding guest to the reception venue, trying to salvage something, but everyone knew the celebration was over. You don't come back from the bride's secret baby being delivered to the altar by a dog. You don't move past that with cake and dancing. Sarah was in an examination room being checked by doctors, not because she was injured, but because the hospital needed to confirm what everyone already suspected. The baby Max had carried into the cathedral was hers. DNA testing would take days, but the timeline matched. Her medical records confirmed the birth, and when pressed by the attending physician, Sarah had finally nodded and admitted the truth. The baby was hers. She'd given birth 3 days before her wedding and walked away, planning to return after the honeymoon to figure out what to do. Except Max had figured it out first. Dogs don't understand human rationalization or the desperate calculations we make when we're trapped between impossible choices. Max just knew that a baby belonged with its mother, and he'd tracked her scent across Portland to reunite them, completely unaware that he was destroying a wedding and exposing years of buried secrets in the process. When Sarah was finally cleared to leave the examination room, when she walked into that waiting area, still wearing her wedding dress, with a hospital bracelet now visible on her wrist, Michael looked at her like she was a stranger. Not with hatred, not yet, just complete incomprehension, like he was trying to reconcile the woman he'd planned to marry with the person capable of what he'd just learned. The confrontation happened in a hospital conference room with 2 police officers present as witnesses. Michael asked her directly, his voice carefully controlled, whether the baby was hers. She nodded. He asked when she'd given birth. She told him 3 days ago. He asked who the father was, and Sarah's silence stretched so long that one of the officers gently prompted her to answer. When she finally spoke, when she told Michael that the father was her ex-husband from Philadelphia, she watched his face go through another transformation. The ex-husband, the bad boyfriend she'd mentioned once or twice in 3 years. The relationship she'd claimed was in her past. Nothing serious, nobody worth discussing. Except he wasn't an ex-boyfriend, he was a husband, and the marriage had never been dissolved. Michael's voice went very quiet when he asked his next question. "Are you still married to him?" Sarah nodded again, tears streaming down her face, and watched the man she loved realize that their entire relationship had been built on lies. He wasn't her fiancé, he was her affair. The wedding license they'd almost signed would have been worthless. And the baby, evidence of that ongoing legal connection to another man, had been hidden from him until a dog literally carried the truth into their ceremony. Michael asked her why. Why lie about being married? Why get pregnant with another man's child and say nothing? Why go through with the wedding when she knew it was all false? And Sarah finally had to tell him the whole story. She told him about David, about the abuse that had driven her out of Philadelphia, about the divorce that had never finalized because David refused to let her go. She told him about the night 18 months ago when David had tracked her down in Portland, when he'd convinced her to meet him at a hotel bar to discuss the divorce, when she'd had 2 drinks and woken up in a hotel room with gaps in her memory and terror so complete she'd almost driven straight off a bridge. She told him she'd suspected David had drugged her, that what happened in that hotel room wasn't consensual, but she'd been too ashamed and frightened to report it. She'd blocked his number, changed her routines, tried to pretend it never happened. When she found out she was pregnant 3 months before the wedding, she'd known immediately it couldn't be Michael's because they'd been waiting, because he'd wanted their first time to mean something. The baby was David's, conceived through what she now understood was assault, and she'd hidden it because admitting it meant admitting everything else. The lies about her marriage, the lies about her past, the lies about who she was. Michael listened to all of this with his hands folded on the table, his face unreadable. When she finished, when her confession finally ran out of words, he asked her one final question. "Did you think I wouldn't understand? Did you really believe that telling me the truth was worse than lying to me for 3 years and showing up pregnant to our wedding?" Sarah had no answer that would satisfy him because they both knew the truth. She'd been so focused on protecting herself, on maintaining the new life she'd built, that she'd sacrificed him to do it. She'd convinced herself that keeping him in the dark was kindness, when really it was cowardice. And now, sitting across from him in a hospital conference room with police officers as witnesses and her wedding dress stained with tears, she had to face what she'd done. Not just to herself, but to the one person who'd offered her genuine love and deserved honesty in return. The look on Michael's face wasn't hatred. It was worse. It was disappointment so profound it looked like grief. He'd loved someone who didn't exist, and now he had to mourn both the woman he thought he knew and the future they'd almost built together. The twist that changed everything came from Max's handler, Robert Chen. He'd been sitting quietly in the corner of that conference room, called in to explain his dog's behavior and make sure Max wasn't facing consequences for technically breaking into a hospital and removing an infant. But Robert had been a police officer for 27 years before retiring, and something about Sarah's story wasn't sitting right. He asked permission to see her hospital records from 3 days ago. The hospital administrator hesitated, citing privacy laws, but Sarah signed a release with shaking hands, too numb to care who saw what anymore. Robert spent 10 minutes reading through the intake notes, the labor and delivery records, the discharge papers. Then he made a phone call to a detective he'd worked with in the sex crimes unit. He put the phone on speaker and asked Sarah a question that made everyone in the room lean forward. "Did David Mitchell know you were pregnant?" Sarah shook her head. She hadn't told him. She hadn't been in contact with him since that night 18 months ago. Robert nodded slowly and asked his detective friend to run David Mitchell's name through the system, specifically looking for reports filed in Portland over the past 2 years. The search results appeared within 5 minutes. David Mitchell's name showed up in 3 separate police reports from Portland. 2 were from women who'd reported being drugged at downtown bars, meeting a man who'd introduced himself by different names but whose description matched perfectly. Both cases had stalled due to lack of physical evidence and the victim's understandable memory gaps. The 3rd report was from a bartender at the hotel where Sarah had met David, filed 6 months after her encounter. The bartender had witnessed a man matching David's description, slipping something into a woman's drink, had confronted him about it, and had been threatened before the man disappeared. The bartender had filed the report out of guilt, hoping it might help build a case if the man struck again. Robert looked at Sarah as he hung up the phone and asked her another question. "Do you remember how you felt after those drinks? Dizzy, confused, like your body wasn't responding the way it should?" Sarah nodded, her face going pale as she began to understand what Robert was suggesting. He turned to the police officers in the room and said it plainly. David Mitchell didn't just happen to track Sarah down. He didn't just happen to convince her to meet him. He'd planned the entire encounter. He drugged her deliberately. And what happened in that hotel room wasn't a mistake or a lapse in judgment. It was assault. It was rape. And the baby was evidence of a crime Sarah hadn't even fully realized she'd survived. The silence in that conference room was absolute. Michael's face shifted again, this time from disappointment to something more complicated, horror mixing with guilt. He'd been so focused on Sarah's lies that he hadn't stopped to ask why she'd lied, what she might have been running from. Sarah was sobbing now, really sobbing, the kind of crying that comes from years of carrying shame that was never hers to carry in the first place. The police officers were already making calls, opening an investigation, talking about tracking David Mitchell down, and finally building the case against him that should have been built years ago. And Max, who'd been lying by the door this whole time, stood up and walked over to Sarah. He rested his head on her lap, the way he'd been trained to provide comfort to trauma victims during his years of service. He'd known something was wrong. Dogs can smell stress hormones, can sense fear and pain in ways humans miss. When he'd found that abandoned baby and caught Sarah's scent nearby, his instincts had told him to reunite them. Not because he understood betrayal or secrets, but because he understood that both the baby and the mother needed help. He delivered truth, and truth, however painful, was what everyone needed. Robert explained the rest of Max's behavior while Sarah tried to compose herself. Max had been at County General 3 days earlier with Robert during a visit to see the police chaplain, whose office was in the hospital's administrative wing. Max had encountered Sarah's scent during her admission, a scent he'd actually smelled once before, during a domestic violence call 6 months earlier to her apartment building. The call hadn't been for Sarah, but for a neighbor, resolved peacefully. But Max had been there, and he'd filed away that scent the way police dogs do. When he'd caught that same scent again at the hospital, attached to a woman who'd just given birth and then left her baby behind, something in his training activated. He'd connected Sarah to the baby because that's what tracking dogs do. They solve puzzles. And when Jennifer Martinez had accidentally placed that infant in Robert's car, when Max had found it within minutes, he'd seen his opportunity. He'd taken the baby carefully, protecting it the way he'd been trained, and he'd tracked Sarah's scent across the city to the place he knew she'd be. The cathedral, the wedding, the moment when truth couldn't be avoided anymore. He hadn't understood the human complications. He'd just known a baby needed its mother, and he knew where she was, so he'd done what needed to be done. The revelation reframed everything about Sarah's story. This wasn't about a bride trying to trap a good man through deception. This was about a woman who'd been running from violence, who'd survived assault, who'd tried desperately to protect everyone, including herself, by burying secrets that were slowly suffocating her. Yes, she'd made mistakes. Yes, she should have told Michael about the uncompleted divorce, about the pregnancy, about all of it. But the core of her deception wasn't malice. It was trauma. It was shame weaponized against her by an abuser who'd made sure his final violation left permanent evidence. Michael sat across from her, processing this shift, understanding that the woman he'd planned to marry was both exactly who he'd thought and completely different. She'd lied to him, yes, but she'd also survived something horrific and tried to claw her way toward normalcy using the only tools she had. That didn't excuse the lies, but it explained them in ways that made his anger more complicated, mixed with guilt for not seeing her pain and regret that she hadn't felt safe enough to tell him the truth before a dog literally forced the revelation. The wedding didn't happen. The marriage license was never signed, the reception was canceled, the honeymoon flights were forfeited, and 200 guests went home with a story they'd be telling for the rest of their lives. But what happened after that day was more complicated than a simple ending could capture. Sarah moved into the women's shelter where she'd been volunteering, finally accepting help instead of trying to provide it while breaking apart inside. She filed a police report about David Mitchell despite knowing prosecution would be difficult given the time that had passed. But her case, combined with the other reports Robert had uncovered, gave investigators enough for a warrant. David was arrested in Philadelphia 2 weeks later on multiple charges. He'd continued targeting women after leaving Portland, leaving a trail of victims who'd been too scared to come forward. Sarah's courage in finally telling the truth helped build the case that led to his conviction 14 months later. 22 years in prison. Sarah's divorce was finalized within 90 days, the judge expediting it given the circumstances. She was finally legally free. Michael took a leave of absence from teaching to process everything. His mother, showing wisdom that surprised everyone, reached out to Sarah 3 weeks after the wedding. That wasn't. She brought food to the shelter, not to demand answers or assign blame, just to make sure Sarah was eating and had someone to talk to. She told Sarah that her son was hurting, but also thinking, trying to understand, trying to figure out what he felt beyond shock and betrayal. She didn't promise that Michael would forgive Sarah or that they'd find their way back together, but she made sure Sarah knew that she, Michael's mother, understood the difference between mistakes made from fear and actions taken from malice. That distinction mattered. It didn't fix everything, but it mattered. Michael and Sarah met for coffee 2 months later, an awkward and painful conversation where neither of them cried because they'd both run out of tears. Michael told her he'd loved the person he thought she was, and he was grieving that loss even while understanding that some of that person had been real. Sarah told him she was sorry, truly sorry, for pulling him into something he'd never signed up for using him as a shield against her trauma without his consent. They didn't get back together. That fantasy ending wasn't realistic given what had happened. Michael needed honesty and transparency, needed to be with someone who could trust him with their whole truth. Sarah needed time alone to figure out who she was when she wasn't running or hiding. But they didn't become enemies either. They became two people who'd almost built a life together, who still cared about each other despite the wreckage, who'd learned hard lessons about trust and trauma and the difference between protecting someone and lying to them. Michael eventually started dating again, finding someone who appreciated his kindness and his need for transparency. Sarah focused on healing, on therapy, on learning to separate shame that belonged to her abuser from responsibility that was actually hers. And the baby Maxwell, named after the dog who'd saved both their lives by refusing to let truth stay buried, became the center of Sarah's world in ways she hadn't expected. She'd planned to give him up for adoption, convinced he was a problem to solve rather than a person to love. But after everything came out, after she stopped running, she looked at her son differently. He wasn't David's weapon. He was a child who deserved love, despite his origins. She kept him. Maxwell is 7 now. He loves dinosaurs and asks questions about his father sometimes that Sarah answers honestly without traumatizing him. She tells him his father made bad choices that hurt people, that he's in prison because of those choices, that Maxwell isn't responsible for anyone's actions but his own. She shows him pictures of Max the German Shepherd, pictures Robert gave her before the dog passed away 4 years after that wedding day. Maxwell keeps one on his nightstand. Sometimes he tells kids at school he was carried by a police dog, and they don't believe him. And he comes home frustrated that his true story sounds impossible. Sarah understands that feeling. Her whole life sometimes feels impossible. Michael is married now to a woman who teaches music at his school, and they have a daughter together. Sarah sees him sometimes around Portland, usually from a distance, and they nod with the complicated recognition of people who share history that can't be summarized. He's not in Maxwell's life. That was a decision they made together, understanding that Michael couldn't be a father figure to a child born from circumstances that had caused him so much pain. And Maxwell needed better than someone who might always see him as a reminder of betrayal. Sarah works at the women's shelter now as a financial counselor, helping survivors plan their escape and rebuild. She tells them, when appropriate, that she knows what it's like to run, to hide, to build a new life on shaky ground. She tells them about Max, about a dog who refused to let truth stay buried, and some laugh and some cry, and all of them understand. Sometimes the truth needs help to surface. Sometimes we need something outside ourselves to force revelations we're too scared to make. Max lived 4 years after that day in the cathedral, long enough to be honored by Portland Police Bureau for his service. Robert brought him to visit Sarah and Maxwell regularly, understanding there was a bond between dog and child that went beyond normal affection. When Max passed away peacefully in his sleep, Sarah took Maxwell to the memorial service. She let her son place flowers on the small headstone, marking where Max was buried. She told him again the story about how a dog understood what humans missed, how truth finds a way out through unexpected messengers. The lesson, if there was one, wasn't simple. It wasn't just tell the truth or trust will save you. It was that secrets have weight, that trauma compounds when carried alone, that shame is often a tool of abusers rather than a response to genuine wrongdoing. And sometimes truth needs help to surface, whether from a dog or from people brave enough to ask difficult questions. So now you know the whole story. A German shepherd crashed a wedding carrying a newborn baby, and the truth that exploded wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't simple betrayal. It was layered with trauma, survival, and the complicated choices we make when we're trying to protect ourselves. Which brings us to the questions that matter. What would you have done if you were Sarah? Would you have told Michael the truth about being married, about the assault, about the pregnancy, even if it meant risking the safe life you'd built? Or do you understand why she kept it hidden, believing some truths are too dangerous to speak? What if you were Michael? Could you forgive someone you love for lying about something so fundamental, especially after learning the lies came from trauma rather than malice? Where's the line between understanding someone's pain and protecting yourself from their choices? And the broader question this story raises, do you believe truth always finds a way out? That secrets eventually surface no matter how carefully we bury them? Or do you think Sarah could have gone her whole life without discovery if Max hadn't been in exactly the right place at exactly the right time? Think about your own life. The secrets you keep, the truths you avoid, the stories you tell yourself about why certain things are better left unsaid. Are you protecting someone or protecting yourself? Are your secrets born from shame about things that weren't your fault or from choices you've made that won't hold up to scrutiny? These aren't easy questions, They make us uncomfortable because the answers force us to examine our own behavior. But they're worth asking. Sarah's story, as dramatic and unusual as it was, touches something universal. We all have things we don't talk about, moments where we chose silence over honesty because honesty felt too risky. The question is whether those choices serve us or slowly poison the connections we're trying to build. Sarah learned sitting in her wedding dress in that hospital conference room that truth doesn't always set us free, but lies definitely trap us. She'd thought she was protecting Michael by not telling him. In reality, she was setting them both up for devastation worse than honesty would have caused. The trauma David inflicted was real and not her fault. But hiding that trauma from someone she claimed to love, that was a choice, and choices have consequences. Here's what makes this story resonate beyond the shocking details. It's the recognition that we're all capable of Sarah's logic. We've all told ourselves that keeping quiet is kindness, that what someone doesn't know can't hurt them. We've all drawn lines about which truths are essential and which can be omitted, and we've all been wrong about where those lines should be. Sarah wasn't a monster. She was a frightened woman who survived violence and tried to survive the aftermath. But her fear made choices that hurt someone who didn't deserve it. That's the complicated reality that makes us human, rather than just sensational. Maxwell is 7 now, asking questions his mother answers honestly, growing up knowing he entered the world in an unusual way. Carried by a police dog who understood crisis, even if he couldn't understand human complexity. Michael is married with a daughter, having found the transparency he needed with someone else. Sarah has rebuilt her life on honesty instead of secrets, helping other women navigate what she barely survived herself. And Max, the German shepherd who started all of this, is remembered as a hero who forced truth into light by simply doing what dogs do, protecting the vulnerable and solving problems in the most direct way possible. What would you do? If you were Sarah, would you have found courage to tell the truth before a dog forced your hand? If you were Michael, could you have forgiven? If you were Maxwell growing up with this story as your origin, would you resent the circumstances or embrace the fact that you're here despite everything? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're invitations to examine your own secrets, your own choices about what you hide and what you reveal. Most of us won't have a dog crash our metaphorical wedding carrying literal evidence of what we've hidden. But truth finds a way eventually. The question is whether we'll be brave enough to let it out on our terms or wait until circumstances force our hand and the revelation is more painful than it needed to be. So let me know, where are you watching from? And what would you have done in Sarah's place? Would you have told the truth earlier? Or do you understand why she kept it hidden? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about truth and D's secrets, and the ways we protect ourselves at the cost of hurting others, then subscribe to this channel because we tell stories like this one, stories that are true and complicated and human, stories that don't have easy answers but force us to ask better questions. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and stick around because there are more stories to tell, more truths that need surfacing, more reminders that we're all just trying to survive with dignity and love and honesty, even when all three feel impossible at the same time.